doing a series for Advent, which in itself is a often discussed matter of the church, whether Advent should be set aside as a time related to Christmas and sort of the cultural trappings of Christmas. You know, the Puritans outlawed Christmas and the observance of Christmas. Excuse me. And that didn't go over well with the people who weren't believers. Christmas, I think, in former times was more raucous and little. And the Puritans often get a black eye for being the ones who always want to squash fun. That's an unfair assessment. But they took their faith and observance seriously, and they saw it as a competitor, probably mostly a Roman Catholic invention, and didn't want it infiltrating their churches, their culture. But I come at it a little bit different in the sense that it's another opportunity to present the Bible. It's another opportunity to talk about biblical truth. We shift gears for about 4 weeks just to focus a little bit more on the incarnation. The actual preaching doesn't change much. It's still supposed to be expository and covering passages, although it's slightly topical because we do isolate a theme. And the theme that we're working on right now are the ladies who are mentioned, the brides that are mentioned in the genealogy of Jesus Christ in Matthew chapter 1. And we've already discussed two of them, Tamar and Rahab. And we haven't had any Wednesday nights related to any of those two names. But just wanted to know if there was anyone that had any extra insight into those two ladies that we discussed previously that anyone wanted to offer up as a offering of inspiration. Now, one thing I wanted to do, maybe to get some grease going here, is to sort of give each of the women a theological word that sort of summarizes something important about them. And so when I think of Tamar, I do want to introduce the word inheritance right off the bat. We're going to be talking about Ruth, that figures prominently as well. But a little bit specific notion with Ruth. Those who are familiar with Ruth know the famous kinsman redeemer line of Ruth. And many sermons have been done on Ruth, and series have been done on Ruth. One of them I remember from one of the bigger churches growing up. The pastor called it The Romance of Redemption. And I thought that was a little interesting. But, you know, there's romance in the book. But Tamar and Rahab have different stories going on, far different from Ruth. Ruth has been called the Hallmark Channel Bible. A woman goes off to some land, things didn't work out. She comes back to her hometown dejected. I know it's a little different. It's a little backwards in that respect. But then she finds the perfect husband, suitor, and things are all better at the end. I don't watch Hallmark movies. Don't make those smirky faces at me. This is just what someone mentioned online. Ruth is like a Hallmark Channel love story. Tamar, I want to associate the word of inheritance with her because she wasn't. And the same thing that's going on with Tamar kind of is going on with Ruth with the Levirate marriage. That if you are a woman, the only way for you to access an inheritance is to be united to someone who has a right to the stuff. And Tamar was not given a husband to fulfill the obligation of caring for the woman. and giving her a lineage and a name and an inheritance with the family. So that's why she reverts to her surreptitious activity. Rahab, I like to use the word inclusion because she was definitely an outsider. And kind of reviewing some of the things about Rahab, she's more fascinating. And just the theological content that surrounds what Israel's doing all around her story is more powerful. I have never preached through Joshua. I've never preached through Ruth, but those are like very compelling books to me now for the future. And I've read through the Bible a couple times, and but when you visit passages you haven't seen in a long time, you come back, it's like, oh, I didn't know that was. Oh, that's really cool. I did a lot of that today in reading through Ruth. But I did see Rahab thematically, analogically, to a picture of who we are outside of God's kingdom. His kingdom is coming over the earth. It's destroying the kingdoms of men. And the kings of this earth are fighting against him. The kings of the earth want us to do their bidding, but we want to be kept away. And we don't want to follow the kings of this earth. We want to welcome the approaching king. And I don't know, I started to see some correlations in how Rahab is saved is easy to equate spiritual realities to us about being outsiders, recognizing that we're lost, that our kingdom is fallen. We need to get to the right kingdom. We put our trust in two witnesses who are spies, but they come and they bring a message of some kind of hope and a token, covenant token of relationship. And then her and her family are brought into this entire new civilization, and that she's at first an outsider, but she's eventually welcomed in and marries in. And this again is another theme of Ruth. You're not supposed to marry foreigners, but all we find in Jesus' lineage are foreigners, except for Jesus' actual mother. We come to the book of Ruth, and usually the word everyone associates with Ruth is the word redemption and the kinsman redeemer, but it's really connected to the Tamar story as well. All right, any thoughts right now about those things? You ladies always do Bible studies, and Ruth, you really know this book probably better than anybody. So anyway, I wanted to just kind of read through the book, get some observations. It's not my intent to necessarily do that on Sunday. I don't know necessarily what I'm going to do on Sunday, but I did realize that Ruth is not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible except for that lineage story of Matthew. So the Bible's pretty ruthless. Thank you very much. So I have another translation that I wanted to read from, alphabetically going through these translations that are supplied by Bible Gateway. I couldn't do the next one because it was only dedicated to the New Testament, the Disciples translation. But Douay Rheims of 1899 says, in the days of one of the judges, so that starts to give you that the period of the judges, does yours have a footnote for potentially which judge could be in charge at that time? That the judges, I think, is a period of some 700 years, or at least 400 years, before Saul comes up as the first king. But we know that from Joshua to Samuel and Saul, there are no kings. That's the period of the judges. That's a long time. When the judges ruled, there came a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem. So here we have that little town that's related to the Christmas story, figuring prominently in an Old Testament text. Bethlehem, Judah, it's called Bethlehem of Judah, went to sojourn in the land of Moab, with his wife and his 2 sons, and his name was Elimelech, and his wife Naomi, and his 2 sons, the one Mahlon and the other Chetlion. To me, those don't jump out to me as Hebrew words, Hebrew names, but evidently they are, because they're thoroughly from Judah. Here it says Ephrathites, from the tribe of Ephraim of Bethlehem in Judah, and entering into the country of Moab, they abode there. So the famine must have been really difficult for people who were given the land as an inheritance under Joshua. Of course, we know through the Judges that there were always Philistines and Canaanites and who knows coming in and harassing the people, Amorites, Hittites, Jebusites. Joshua was supposed to completely secure the land so that they could live there in peace, but it didn't seem like that was the situation. And if a drought comes upon the very land where God had promised to have flowing with milk and honey, you would sort of feel like maybe we're being abandoned, or maybe God is judging us. But you got to eat, so you got to go somewhere. I keep hearing some of our modern day popular speakers saying all bets are off when people can't eat. So, you're not going to have a society that can maintain itself if they can't find food. So it's very important that we make sure that this supply chain of food is not interrupted. And a lot of people have been making comments about who's buying farmland in America, what they're doing in the Netherlands. They're shutting down 3,000 farms because they think it's hurting the climate. It's a climate agenda thing. So they're just going to tell 3,000 farmers that they can't do it anymore. And they're already admitting that with the war in Ukraine, it's a little bit of a sideline here, that they can't feed their own people right now as it is. So it's going to get really precarious. So there's this famine going on. They decide that they're going to go to Moab, who is just adjacent to Israel to the southeast, but are the descendants of another compromised relationship. People say that this is from Lot and his daughter, that's the origins of these people, that they were also religiously corrupted and not the type of people that God wanted his people to interact with, or certainly not to intermarry. There was this reference to Deuteronomy 23:3 that spoke of a direct curse against the people of Moab and that they were not allowed to marry them. But here they go looking for food. Verse 4, now they took wives of the women of Moab. The name of one was Orpah. The name of the other was Ruth, and they dwelt there about 10 years. Then both Mahlon and Chilion died. So the woman survived her 2 sons and her husband. I was reading that from the King James. So Elimelech passes away, and then the 2 boys get married, and then they pass away. And now Ruth is only connected to 2 stepdaughters, right? Is that what we call them? Daughters-in-law. What's the right word? And so now there's this moment of decision. Naomi figures, why don't you girls go on and get married? But before we finish that, let's just go to the Ruth. Golly, let's go to the Old Testament and just look at the first verse in our interlinear. when you see the W's, you're supposed to make that a V. That's a Vav. I don't know why they didn't make it a V, but anyways, this is the first passage, the first verse of Ruth, and you can all see the important words that are listed there. But the only thing I wanted to point out is the word Bethlehem. You can see Mabet, Bet Lachem, house of bread, Lam and Chet Mem, and all the vowel markings here. So that's what Bethlehem looked like in the Hebrew. And pretty much the only word that I probably could figure out on my own without seeing it written out underneath. So Naomi's got this trouble, and she wants to tell her daughters in verse 8 to go home to their own mothers. And she's not laying a guilt trip on them or anything. She just wants them to go off and start a life. She says she can't produce any more children for them. Kind of an interesting conversation. So just go back to where your culture is and your people, and I'll be fine. I'll go back to my people. And we know that Orpah decides to heed that advice, but Ruth, she can't be convinced to leave. And you can see in the New King James how they have this indented. Someone on some translation team thinks this is some kind of a song or some kind of a poem that they would give it that structure. You know, this is not just a conversation. This is someone who's monologuing, as they say. And what she ends up saying is really tender and profound. And it reads easier in the New King James than this other version that I've got up. But where you die, I will die. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. So she is very, very committed to Naomi. I don't know why, except outside of God's plans for the Savior to come. There's this Ruth is going to figure prominently in the life of Christ, which again brings me to this great conundrum of, hey, those guys aren't doing what they should be doing. They know they shouldn't be marrying Moabitesses, but here God uses it. Why does he do that? Why does he take something that don't do it, and the next thing you know, well, if they hadn't done that, if these circumstances hadn't happened, then we wouldn't be here to have what God really wanted. That ties me up. But the thing I think is really tender, most of all, is that she's expressing these very words of the covenant. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. We have this part of our liturgy in our congregation that after the scriptures are read, these are the words of God for the people of God. And then the people are supposed to recite this very line that she's reciting. I want to belong to these covenant people. So that's what she's really expressing, is I want to belong to the covenant people. Most churches, after they read their scriptures publicly and the pastor says this is the word of the Lord, most people say something like, praise be to God. What other traditions did you go with? That's usually the standard reply. Our church is probably, how many churches do what we do on a Sunday morning? Maybe 0.001% of churches do what we do. But as a pastor and trying to teach some of the most profound language of the Bible, I will be your God and you will be my people, is the, you should be hearing bells in your brain when you hear that. That's the very words of the covenant that God promised to have a people for himself. And Israel never heard that with confidence. They were promised that they would hear that from God. They were promised that that's the relationship they would have. But along those prophets come along and say, we need a new covenant because this one's not working. They don't want to act like God's people. But here's a Moabitess basically quoting the verses, the phrase that says, I want to belong to God and I want to be a faithful member of his covenant. It's really powerful. So if anyone wants to pop up and say something, you may do so. So in verse 18, Naomi sees that Ruth is steadfastly determined to go with her, and she's not going to. Naomi in verse 20 decides that she doesn't want to be called Naomi anymore, which means beautiful, but she wants to be called Mara, which is bitter. For the Almighty hath quite filled me with bitterness. So she's like a psalmist here. She's just going to let it all out. Here we have a Moabitess claiming she's going to go to death following a covenant people. But Naomi / Mara, she feels like she's been abandoned and she's going to let everyone know. So Mara would be, I think, a derivative of the name Mary. So here's a Mara going to Bethlehem and has no baby. And I don't know, is that something to mess around with? Until one day we have a Mary who comes to Bethlehem. I don't know what Mary was saying, because we know that she was kind of put out being pregnant. I'm sure she had some laments of her own, if she was riding on a donkey whatsoever, the classic Christmas scenes. We get the impression that it's not a happy time for them to be running off to Bethlehem while she's ready to give birth, and they get there, there's no place to stay.
We think Joseph accepted it, but a lot of people around her probably did not.
Yeah. Well, so she says, I went out full and the Lord hath brought me back empty. Why then do you call me Naomi, whom the Lord hath humbled and the Almighty hath afflicted? So that's not what we'd want to put on our tombstone. It's not a very faith-filled line, but it's very honest. And yet she changes. She realizes why they came back together. She is full of praise of God eventually. But here's a time in her life where she's just being bold-faced honest. I feel abandoned and I feel terrible. And she's sort of like me. She's making it personal. God, you're doing this to me. And so I'm mad. Anyway, well, they returned to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So that's right around spring time. That's really right around resurrection time of Jesus. So Naomi comes back feeling that the worst is happening. And Tony Campolo would say, it's Friday right now, but Sunday's coming. So that, I don't know if the authors intended, I don't know who the author of Ruth is. Does anybody know?
Ruth, it says Samuel is the traditionally known as the author.
That would be like the tagline after she's expressed all of her bitterness. He says, but the harvest was coming. That's poetic. At least it is to me. There's some good footnotes down here from the New King James. I do want you to know that in my study of the Jewish burial boxes, that I think the number one girl name inscribed on those burial boxes is Mary, which would indicate a lot of people were feeling kind of bitter at that time. I don't know if you guys want to look up what they think Mary's name means, but I think it's a derivative of bitterness.
Mara?
Yeah, Mara and Mary. We call her Mary. We should look that up. Part of our Sunday assignment. Now her husband, Elimelech, who's now dead, had a kinsman, a powerful man and very rich, whose name was Boaz. I like the way they spell it in this 1899 version, booze. And Ruth the Moabitess said to her mother-in-law, if thou wilt, I will go into the field and glean the ears of corn and escape the hands of the reapers. Whoever I shall find grace with a householder, that will be favorable to me. And she answered, go, my daughter. And in my reading of Ruth, there seems to me that it's dangerous for a girl to be alone. Like she could get into trouble, like trouble would come upon her. I'm like, wait a minute, this is Israel. This is where people live by the law of God. Oh boy, there was a.
They never did.
I know.
So it says
Yeah.
it can mean three different things: beloved, bitter, or rebellious.
Oh wow,
The name Mary.
And I've always heard sorrow,
sorrow.
Maria.
Hmm.
Huh. Beloved or rebellious?
All right, very good.
Oxymoron names.
So there is provisions in the law of Moses that poor people are allowed to follow the reapers, and they're to glean. They're allowed to glean from the corners of the fields. I don't know all of the Mosaic law. I do clearly know that's stipulated in the scriptures. In fact, I think they say don't harvest the corners of the field, so
Yeah.
that the poor people are allowed to go there. And that would feel kind of interesting. You hire a bunch of people, and then you see a bunch of other folks out there picking along. But it is supposed to be noted that as they come back to Bethlehem, out of all the fields that she begins to look at, it's Boaz's field. She could have been in who knows whomever's field. So another hand of providence at play. And Boaz notices her, and he invites her to stay and actually join his maids. They're called his work crew. And it seems on another occasion that he basically tells his workers, yeah, when she's behind you, don't take as much. Let her get as much as she can. And here's a very cool conversation, verse 10. When she's noticed by Boaz, she fell on her face and worshiping on the ground said to him, whence cometh this to me, that I should find grace before thy eyes, and that thou shouldst vouchsafe to take notice of me, a woman of another country? She doesn't know why Boaz is showing all of this grace to her, and she really expresses it in a profound way. And when I first read that, I felt like that's sort of like what comes off the lips of a sinner when God reveals his grace and kindness to a sinner. It's like, wow, why are you treating me like this? Why are you accepting me? Why are you gracing me with your favor? She suddenly has it from Boaz, and he says he's heard about her character, her commitment, and he wants to reward her for her commitments to Naomi, and she decides to come back to live among the people of God. And then he uses this line here in 12, thou art come, and under whose wings thou art fled. He wants her to come under the wings of somebody to find comfort. Of course, that's a very famous psalm that gets sung in the ARP, under his wings.
Just
Yeah.
back to the gleaning. It's Leviticus 19:9. Not to glean up to the edge, or after harvest, do not glean.
Okay, very good. Then in verse 14, she's invited to a meal, and she gets to eat bread, and it's called, oh, look at intinction, dip thy morsel in the vinegar. I'm going to call that wine. I'm going to call this a proto-Lord's Supper, a communion meal. Although I do like, when you go to the Italian restaurants and you get to dip your bread in the oil and the vinegar, I like that too. But suddenly now she's being fed, and then she's getting to take extras back to her mother-in-law. And then the mother-in-law kind of figures out what's going on. Ruth keeps on sharing everything with her mother, all the things that she gleans. And then after this meal, it sounds like she's like hiding it and keeping all the leftovers to bring back to her mother-in-law. And then there's this line. So now here we see no, it's spelled differently in this. Naomi. Naomi now comes back to her faithfulness again. Blessed be he of the Lord, because the same kindness which he showed to the living he hath kept also to the dead. And again she said, this man is our kinsman. So she did have a day of darkness. Now she's back, understanding that God had a plan for it all, which means she's pretty much a normal believer. So she has a plan for her to meet with Boaz, right? That comes in the next chapter. I remember seeing one of the footnotes that do you guys know the Hebrew word for redeemer? Goel. Someone made something of that. I think they made a rhyme out of it. But a Goel. And Ruth is a Goyim. She's a Gentile. Do you think the Jews thought that the Moabites, who were kind of related, as far as the story of their people saw them? I mean, God said they weren't allowed to marry them for like 10 generations. So, well, then there's the plan, that she tells Ruth to wash up and perfume up and get the best clothes on, and then very secretively go lay at his feet while they're sleeping. And in verse 5 of chapter 3, she answers, "Ew, that's gross." No, like Ruth does every single thing her mother-in-law tells her. So yeah, her people are her people, and she's doing everything. Evidently, there's some big meal on the barn floor, and Boaz and all of his friends eat, and they fall asleep. And then she sneaks in at night, and she lays at his feet. Verse 9, he said to her, "Who art thou?" And she answered and said, "I am Ruth, thy handmaid. Spread thy coverlet over thy servant, for thou art a near kinsman." So there's quite a lot of, I don't know what we'd call it, quite a lot of actions that indicate something, like to make something formal. She knows that formally she has to be at his feet, and he has to put some kind of a blanket on her or something to say that, okay, I'm covering you. These are going to be my wings. I'm going to cover you under my wings, and I'm going to take care of you. But before he can do that, and again, he speaks of a reputation. Before he can do that, he recognizes that there's another man who actually has right to claim her. There's a person who's in the family that's closer to Elimelech. And that ends up being the transaction that takes place in the last chapter, right? If you guys remember anything I'm not mentioning as I'm speeding through this, speak up. So here comes this deal. Boaz meets this man. "Oh yeah, there's this piece of land for sale. You want it?" He's like, "Yeah." He says, "Well, if you so she can have a share in the inheritance." And then he's worried that that's going to complicate his life. And so,
Yeah, can you specify what he's talking about there when he says it's going to basically jeopardize his inheritance? What's that?
well, I can't say specifically. I'll do some more reading into it, but it seems to me that there's some kind of an ordinal. We've already seen that Boaz is not the right person in line.
Mm-hmm.
if he marries someone else and, you chase down the family tree and all of a sudden this man being married to this woman obligates her to have more from someone else that he intended to give it to, might be the complication. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
So if he produces a child with this person, she might be actually popping in front of line of someone else that he had intended for it. I'm not positive about that, but that's something that I'm concerned about.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting too that Boaz makes this deal without even mentioning it at first, and then sort of knows that that's gonna like be the deal breaker.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I always felt. I
Yeah.
always felt he was being sneaky.
Well, yeah. I mean, well, you don't ever walk up and say, "Hey, you want to marry someone who needs?"
No.
But it's a property. I mean, I think we're looking at it from a Western idea
Obviously.
of marriage. This is a property transaction. The land is what they're talking about. So yeah, this lady comes along with it. But if you're going to the gate or whatever of the town to talk about stuff, you're talking about legal matters. And
Mm-hmm.
so, I mean, I don't know that he was trying to be sneaky, but it does, from our perspective, since we know what it's getting to,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
does sound sneaky.
Well, this man in verse 6 is fine with the deal after he hears the whole situation. I yield up my right of next akin, for I must not cut off the posterity of my own family.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Do thou make use of my privilege, which I profess I do willingly forego. Isn't that language sound so good from 1899? So and then they mark this important decision by exchanging a shoe, which I think has fallen by the wayside in our day. Is there some old idiomatic phrase that has to do with shoes anymore? After a while, you don't see people saying, "Put your hand between my thigh." That sort of passes along the way too, and giving people the shoe. Women sleeping at someone being covered speaks of an older, genteel time. Verse 9, and he said to the ancients and to all the peoples, you are witnesses this day that I have bought all that was Elimelech's and Chilion's and Mahlon's of the son of Naomi, and have taken to wife Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of Mahlon, to raise up the name of the deceased in his inheritance, lest his name be cut off from among his family and his brethren and his people. You, I say, are witnesses of this thing. Remember that line when the Apostle Paul, it just occurs to me, when he says, if you want to be about circumcising, why don't you cut it off? And a lot of people have thought, oh man, that's pretty graphic, But I think there's also the notion of being cut off from the inheritance. If you think you're going to earn the inheritance, the heavenly spiritual inheritance by physical means, you're going to be cut off because you can't inherit that way. The only way for Boaz to inherit is to do it this way. In Christ, our inheritance is by Jesus, who is the kinsman redeemer, who has done everything. It would feel really awkward if Ruth still tried to do things to try to earn the property. It's like, no, it's ours. We've got it. What are you doing? You don't have to do anything else. Just a thought that came to my brain. So the people witness this and they all affirm it. And then we see that verse 13, Boaz takes Ruth, marries her, and they bore a son.
Mm-hmm.
And is that son's name Obed? And then he's the father of Jesse, who's the father of David. All right. So That'd be great if Samuel wrote this, because it really gets us ready for the guy who should have been king at first. Samuel would have said, this is. Samuel didn't know when he went to the house who was supposed to be the king. It was a son of Jesse, and he had several of them, but he didn't know it was going to be David. But he knew he had to go. Is this after he wrote Ruth or before? All right. So any big teachings that you've gleaned from the book of Ruth about being a kinsman redeemer, or the whole situation?
I thought it was interesting when he's trying to bless him, or whatever we call that, verse 11 and 12, that he pulls out Perez, Tamar's son.
Oh, really?
Like, why in the world?
Where was that?
11 and 12. He's kind of proclaiming a blessing. Oh, may she be like Rachel and Leah. May she be, or may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore. Just interesting, of all the people that he would pull him out.
Very good.
Her,
You know, I didn't notice that was Perez, because see how it's spelled so differently in the version I was reading?
Yeah.
Look at that. Yeah, so Tamar gets another mention.
I mean, you kind of understand why he would say Rachel and Leah.
Yeah.
I mean, because they're important. I mean, they're just,
So it's so this is going to get me to start looking at some of the Jewish rabbis and what they say about these passages, because to the Jewish people, David and Solomon are like the ideal kings. We as Christians are always looking for the son of David who is promised the throne, but we know it's not Solomon. We know it's not Jeroboam or Rehoboam, which I always confuse those two. None of his sons eventually. And in fact, we get a son being cursed by it saying, no longer will anyone from the line of Jehoiakim sit on the throne. I'm like, whoa, that he just wiped out half of the possibilities. He just actually ends up wiping out all of Joseph's line with that curse. So isn't it beautiful that another Mara from who goes to Bethlehem becomes the one who produces the son of David who will always sit upon the throne. This is a line from Isaiah 54, verse 4. Fear not, you will not be ashamed. Be not confounded, for you will not be disgraced. For you will forget the shame of your youth and the reproach of your widowhood. You will remember no more, which, if you go back to the time when Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth just had dealt with the passing of all their husbands, they're all widows. I made a mistake. I call someone a widow when it's a widower. I just saw that the other day. But they're all, man, can you imagine just the emotional distress of that time? And then they have to make this emotionally distressing decision of whether to go back to live with their people again. There's just high emotions that we're a little distant from. We all know what emotions are, but these people are really feeling it. And then it says in Isaiah 54:5, for your maker is your husband. The Lord of hosts is his name. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. The God of the whole earth he is called. So God sees himself as the Redeemer. He's the one who purchases us off the slave market, but he also considers us his husband. Wait, did I say that right? He considers himself to be our husband. And then Israel was supposed to be this faithful bride to him. But we know in the book of Jeremiah, he ushers a bill of divorce to both Judah and Israel, this divided kingdom. And one of the most famous Christian doctrines is union with Christ, being united to Christ, taking possession of everything that belongs to him. So in the Old Testament, there was this template of understanding marriage and union and sharing of everything. And so then Christianity leans so heavy on that marriage motif as far as a theological analogy to what we have as believers. So I don't think we think enough about inheritance, and we probably don't think enough about, the realities of marriage. That's why Paul could really say easily, I'm speaking about Christ and his church. It's like, this is the real reason marriage has the shape it has. And then Jesus is called the firstborn from among the dead. Well, he wasn't the first person to come from the dead, but he's the firstborn, meaning he's the inheritor of everything. He's the inheritor of all that belongs to God. And since we're united to him, and that's why we also call him our eldest brother, he's the firstborn. So he's the first in line to receive everything and everyone who's united to him. So we have a lot of imageries kind of folding in on top of each other, but it's all there to communicate the blessings that we have. So if you ever feel like Naomi, that you've left full and come back empty and everything is, that's a place God actually wants you to be. He actually wants you to confess it so that he can fill you up properly with the things that are really eternally fulfilling. So, all right. That's all I have for our casual discussion. Once again, if you ever find anything that's good to share, send it my way. And yeah.
You know about Samuel now.
Yeah.
So that's good.
Yeah. Out of all of the women of the Bible, Ruth stands there as a luminary because she just seems to be so committed, so honorable. She's sort of like one of the Daniel and Joseph figures, but she really doesn't get much press outside of her own text. I'll have to see if there's any other allusions to her in the scriptures. I just know by name she's not listed. But she becomes, again, another completely important pattern of what redemption looks like. Someone who's widowed, has nothing, has no connection to any inheritance, and finds favor with the one who, as it says here in Isaiah, he's the God of the whole earth. So he's not just concerned about the land of Israel anymore. His redemption is worldwide now. And we get to participate in that by grace, through faith, on account of Christ. All right, let's pray. Lord, thank you for these truths that we've read this day. Help us to become more familiar with this text, and certainly for the benefit of understanding the gospel of Jesus Christ, for recognizing the patterns of redemption and what we possess. We know when we think of redemption, the obvious reference is to the Israelites leaving Egypt, but here's a tender and personal explanation of it that, again, communicates the blessings of being connected to one who has the inheritance of everything. You plan to be the one who fulfills all the promises, and because you've given us the promise keeper in Jesus Christ. Help us to meditate on these things and to glorify you for them. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right.